Hey guys, tonight we comb gently into the surprisingly soothing world of Viking self-care. You're surrounded by chill morning fog clinging low across the fjords, a gull cackling overhead like it's had one too many cups of fermented fish tea. In the distance, the warm orange glow of a hearth flickers through the slats of a wooden longhouse. And inside, well, you're not sharpening an axe, you're sharpening your look. That's right, we're talking hair combs. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing when and where people are nodding off to this gloriously boring history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink into the rising sun, stretch under a wool blanket, and scratch the side of your head, only to reach over for your prized possession, a carved antler comb. Smooth, sturdy, and finer than anything sold at medieval IKEA, this comb isn't just for vanity, it's a staple. You run it through your hair, careful not to tug because pulling hair in the morning is how Viking tempers get tested. Not battles, just bad knots. The Vikings, contrary to the mud and blood aesthetic Hollywood often serves up, were pretty into grooming. Archaeologists have unearthed dozens of combs from graves camps and even latrines. These weren't toss-away items. Some were ornately carved with knotwork, others shaped from bone antler or even walrus ivory. One find even included a protective leather case, as if to say, yes, my comb deserves VIP treatment. Historians still argue whether this attention to appearance was mostly about attracting partners, maintaining social status, or just keeping lice at bay. Likely it was all three, romance, reputation, and ridding yourself of freeloaders. Next comes beard care. You dip a cloth into warm water and press it to your face. Your beard, or at least the stubbly potential of one, gets fluffed and patted like a prized sheep. Vikings often used beard beads, metal or wooden rings slid onto braids for decoration. A little flair goes a long way when your other accessories are mostly axes and sheep. Fringe theory alert: some scholars believe Viking beard beads held magical properties or were worn to represent clan allegiance. Others think they were the ancient Norse equivalent of flexing a Rolex, just with more goats involved in the supply chain. And speaking of goats, their horns sometimes served as containers for oils, not for salad dressing, for hair. You pour a little on your fingers, maybe it's lard, maybe it's scented with herbs like juniper or sweet gale, and rub it into your hairline. You look in a polished bronze mirror and tilt your head just right. Not bad at all. The mirror's not a trick of modern nostalgia either. Viking-era mirrors have been recovered, albeit not as reflective as glass ones. Usually made of polished metal or imported goods, they did the job. Though let's be honest, lighting was kind of working against you. Picture yourself trying to line up a braid in candlelight. You'd either come out looking like a warrior poet or a barn owl caught in a windstorm. Your tunic's still rumpled from sleep, so you smooth it out. It's linen or wool, depending on the season, and your personal budget wool, if you're fancy, scratchy, and cold-resistant. Your belt is simple leather tied with a bronze buckle, shaped like Thor's hammer. Why, because even when grooming, one must casually remind the world you're thunder-aligned. And don't forget your nails. Vikings trimmed them regularly. Neatly cut fingernails were seen as a sign of cleanliness, and there's an actual Norse myth that says untrimmed nails from corpses were used to build the ship Naglfar, which would sail during Ragnarok to bring doom to the gods. So yeah, trim your nails, or doom the universe. No pressure. You move to the fire and sit cross-legged, reaching for a chunk of soap. It's soft and fatty, probably made from leftover cooking grease mixed with ash. Rustic, effective, and no added fragrance unless your toddler dropped wildflowers into the cauldron again. You wash your face, rubbing slow circles across your cheeks and down your neck. The steam feels like a blanket. Your pores are practically purring. Now a touch of oral hygiene. No electric toothbrushes here, but there's evidence of toothpicks made from bone or wood. A few graves have even yielded tweezers and ear scoops. Ear scoops, my friend. You, in all your futuristic glory, still haven't upgraded to that level of dedication. At this point, your hair is braided or tied, your beard is scented, your skin's squeaky-ish clean, and you're halfway through humming an old lullaby you don't remember learning. Probably something your grandmother sang while braiding your hair by the fire. It's got no words, just soft hums, and the occasional that lingers like warm honey. One curious find, a small pouch buried alongside a Viking woman in Denmark, contained a few beads, a comb, and a tiny copper spoon. Scholars debate whether the spoon was used for applying salves or scooping powdered herbs for scenting the skin. Personally, you like to imagine it was a proto-lotion spatula used before selfies were a thing. You glance outside. A neighbor waves his hair, slicked back with what looks suspiciously like pine tar. You nod approvingly. Game recognizes game. In the background, your cat, the one with the missing ear, and the attitude of a retired sea captain, paws at your braid and yawns, clearly impressed. Or maybe hungry. It's always a toss-up with cats. You toss another log on the fire and let the scent of smoke and clean wool wrap around you. You are groomed. You are fragrant. You are armed with hygiene and ready to tackle a day of mostly peaceful domesticity. And maybe, just maybe, you'll finally convince your cousin to stop braiding his beard like a fishnet. You step outside into the crisp morning air, boots crunching over frost-tipped grass, and feel your newly cleaned hair lift slightly in the breeze. There's a content little smugness in your stride, as if your well-oiled beard might earn nods of respect from every goat herder in the village. The sun glints off rooftops of sod and timber, and beyond that, hills roll gently like the folds in your grandmother's quilts. But this isn't about hair anymore. Now it's about your threads. The Viking wardrobe was not, as pop culture might have you believe, limited to wolf pelts and leather pants. In fact, you're feeling quite pleased with your layered ensemble and under-tunic, over-tunic, woven belt and thick cloak. It's fashion meets insulation. You're basically an onion with excellent tailoring. Mainstream historical fact, incoming most Viking clothing was made of wool, not because they hated comfort, but because sheep were practical, warm, and conveniently mobile. Spinning wool into thread was often women's work, done with drop spindles beside the hearth while telling stories or humming about trolls who live in tree roots. But don't be fooled, this wasn't all drab oatmeal-colored frocks. Vikings loved color. Really. Fragments of fabric show dyes in shades of deep blue, rusty red, golden ochre, and even fancy greens. Indigo and madder root made appearances, and if you were upper-class, silk threads might sneak in too. Silk. Actual imported silk from as far away as Byzantium. You standing here with your silk-edged sleeve are basically wearing ancient couture. Historians still argue whether these colorful styles were just reserved for the elite, or whether everyday folks like to jazz up their look now and then. Either way, your linen undertunic is a soft gray, your woolen overtunic a rich, hand-dyed blue that makes your eyes pop, or at least distracts from your slightly frostbitten nose. You cinch your belt, which isn't just decorative, it's also your portable storage unit. From it hangs your knife, a leather pouch with dried berries and hazelnuts, and your fire-striking tools. Think of it like a Viking fanny pack, but infinitely cooler and more likely to contain sharp things. There's a small cloak pin in the shape of a stylized bear. It holds your outer layer closed and tells the world two things. One, you are not cold. Two, you are not to be messed with unless someone wants to be aggressively hugged by someone wearing 100 layers. And then there are your socks. Yes, socks. Knitted with a technique called nole binding, which predates knitting as we know it. You wiggle your toes proudly. They're thick, slightly itchy, but they work. You once lost a pair in the communal sauna and had to endure a week of chilly ankles. Never again. Fringe fact time, there's some evidence to suggest Vikings used leather shoes padded with moss. Yes, moss. As insulation. So technically you're walking on nature's carpet and it's both cozy and compostable. And let's be honest, moss in your shoes is way more sustainable than what your cousin Bjorn wears, those fish skin boots that smell like ambition and regret. You walk toward the weaving shed where women sit working long hours at upright looms. One of them eyes your tunic. "Did your wife dye that herself?" she asks, not unkindly. You nod. "With onion skins and woad," you reply. This is met with an impressed grunt, basically a standing ovation in Viking terms. The spinning wheels haven't been invented yet, so flax and wool are still spun by hand. You pause to admire the quiet rhythm of the spindle twirling in a practiced hand. The room smells like lanolin and hay. It's peaceful in a very fuzzy way. But even in this cozy domesticity, you spot signs of hierarchy. One woman's cloak has a trim of tablet-woven gold thread, a sign that she or someone in her family knows people, important people, or she's just really good at bribing dyers. You scratch your elbow and glance over at the drying rack. Herb bundles hang there, lavender, wormwood, wild thyme, used in dyes, salves, and sometimes tucked into cloaks for scent and a bit of bug repelling. Nothing says luxury like "I don't smell like onions today." Back at your own longhouse, your child holds up 2 tunics, one with embroidered cuffs, one without. You pick the fancier one because sometimes you need to feel like a Norse noble, even if your main job is wrangling sheep and dodging fjord geese. You pull it on, admire yourself in a polished brooch reflection, and smile. Your partner wraps a scarf around your shoulders, a rectangular piece of wool with tiny tassels at the ends. Not a fashion statement, a love statement. A gesture that says, "You'll probably forget your cloak again, so here's a backup." One last detail, the hat. It's wool, of course, possibly lined with fur, and it squashes your hair just a little, but that's okay. Viking hair always bounces back. You step into the yard like a slow-motion warrior in a really cozy indie film. Somewhere a lute plays, and just as you pass the goat pen, a small boy with muddy knees points to your cloak pin. "Is that real bronze?" he asks, wide-eyed. You nod. "Passed down from my grandmother." He stares as if you've said, "Thor gave it to you personally." Then he wipes his nose under his sleeve and runs off, chasing a chicken. You adjust the pin slightly. Yeah, Thor would probably approve. The sun hasn't climbed far and your fingers are already stinging a little as you haul open the door to the storehouse. Inside, everything smells of smoked meat, dried fish, and maybe a little mildew from that one forgotten corner. You're not here for food, though, not yet. You're here for grooming gear. Yes, grooming. Personal hygiene in the Viking age, the soft underbelly of their surprisingly civilized lifestyle. And while the sagas tend to emphasize swordplay and revenge, they're suspiciously quiet on the topic of beard maintenance. But not you. You're living the truth, one comb stroke at a time. Mainstream fact. Vikings were very into grooming, like surprisingly into it. Archaeologists have found loads of personal care items, combs, tweezers, ear picks, razors, all lovingly carved, sometimes with delicate patterns or even inlaid with bronze. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about looking respectable. If you were meeting a chieftain or sailing into a new town, you did not want to look like a crusty hermit who fought a bear and lost. So you grab your bone comb from a little carved box. The handle is smooth from years of use. You rake it slowly through your hair, pausing to untangle a knot that might be harboring a small pine cone. It's oddly meditative. Combing is your Viking version of scrolling on your phone in bed, except more wholesome and definitely splinter-free. Fringe tidbit: some believe combs were also status symbols like jewelry, not just for vanity but for showing others you had time and resources to care for yourself. That little comb dangling from your belt. That's not just hygiene, it's social flexing. Historians still argue whether Vikings carried grooming kits on voyages just for personal use or to trade them like ancient Avon sales reps. There's even speculation that combs were given as gifts, possibly to woo a potential spouse or to subtly tell someone, hey, you're great, but also your hair's a disaster. You sit by the hearth now, sharpening your small blade, not for battle, but for trimming your mustache. See, nothing ruins a hot bowl of broth faster than an untrimmed lip sweeper acting like a mop. Plus, if your hair's neat, your enemies will at least die thinking, wow, they looked great doing it. In the corner of the room is a little jar of animal fat mixed with herbs. It's your homemade hair pomade. Smells faintly of thyme and, well, ram, you rub a bit into your beard. It helps tame the wild curls and keep the cold wind from making your face feel like it's been slapped by 1,000 snowflakes. This isn't vanity, it's survival, but survival with flair. A younger villager leans in watching you. Why do you comb your beard so much, they ask. You glance at them, raise an eyebrow, and answer, because it frightens my enemies when I'm this well-groomed. They blink, unsure whether you're joking. You are, mostly. Across the room, a pair of tweezers dangle from another belt. Yep, tweezers. Not for eyebrows, though, hey, no judgment, but for removing splinters, ticks, and the occasional battle thorn. They're made of bronze shaped like tiny tongs, and make you wonder if the Viking aesthetic was less grunge warrior and more Scandinavian spa day. And speaking of questionable trends, let's talk teeth. Some Viking skulls have been found with etched grooves across the front teeth, horizontal lines carved right into the enamel. Were they symbols of bravery? Battle accomplishments, midlife crises? Historians still argue whether it was decorative, ritualistic, or just a weird fashion moment that someone regretted the next day over mead. Now it's time for a little ear cleaning. You pull out your ear spoon, yes, a tiny spoon for ears. It's made of copper and shaped like a miniature paddle. You use it delicately, humming a tune that sounds like it was invented specifically to accompany the act of excavating earwax. Peaceful, oddly satisfying, slightly gross, all the best Viking things are. At the riverbank later, you spot others rinsing off some standing knee-deep in the icy water like they're immune to frostbite. You're not quite that bold. You splash your face scrub behind your ears and mutter something about wishing for heated towels. A bird caws judgmentally from a tree. You dry your hands on a woolen cloth that doubles as a hand towel and pot holder. It smells faintly of juniper smoke. You make a mental note to ask your partner to soak the laundry in thyme water again. It leaves a better scent and allegedly wards off spirits. Practical and metaphysical. There's a lull in the village now. People are out working, chopping wood, or tending livestock. You take a moment to sit near the fire, comb in hand, smoothing your hair while staring into the flickering flames. It's quiet, a kind of sacred grooming silence. Like the Norse gods themselves have declared, take 10, fix your bangs. Your fingers itch to braid something, and why not braids are both stylish and functional. They keep your hair out of your eyes and offer a perfect excuse to gossip while your friend helps you with that complicated knot you never quite mastered. You hum under your breath, thinking how far grooming's come and how little it's changed. We still like to feel good, smell decent, and look like someone who has their life vaguely together. Vikings just did it with more wool and less Wi-Fi. And maybe, just maybe, that little bone comb on your belt says more about you than your sword ever could. A gust of wind rattles the wooden shutters as you step back inside, cheeks glowing from the cold, and your beard now looking absolutely award-winning. You're not sure who would be handing out Viking grooming medals, but if there were such a council, you'd expect at least a ribbon, maybe a jar of honey. Either way, you've earned it. Now comes the question of what to wear, because contrary to popular imagery, you don't just throw on a bearskin and call it a day. Viking clothing is layered, practical, and yes, occasionally fabulous. You're reaching into a chest at the edge of the room, fingers brushing over linen, wool, and fur-lined goodies that would make a fashion historian weep with joy. Mainstream fact: Viking fashion was largely influenced by climate. With freezing winters and damp conditions, layers of wool, linen undergarments, and waterproof cloaks were the daily uniform. Women wore long tunics and aprons fastened with beautiful brooches, while men sported trousers often fitted with ties or drawstrings, and tunics with belts. Not so different from your own wardrobe, just swap yoga pants for leg wraps and hoodies for hand-stitched wool tunics. Quirky tidbit: Vikings sometimes wore clothes dyed in bold colors, reds, yellows, even purples. These weren't just for flair, they also showed wealth, since natural dyes took time, effort, and a very specific plant inventory. There's evidence some dyes were made from lichens, fungi, or fermented plant mash that smelled like someone forgot a salad in the sun. Worth it for a nice burgundy tunic, though. You settle on a forest green tunic today, thickly woven, soft from wear, and embroidered at the cuffs with the little repeating knotwork patterns. Your grandmother made it. The cuffs are slightly uneven because she drank too much mead during the last festival and claimed symmetry is for cowards. You believe her. Over the tunic you pull on a leather belt with a simple bronze buckle. Everything hangs from this belt: knife, comb, small pouch of dried fruit, and because you're fancy, a tiny mirror made of polished metal. You use it to check your beard one more time. Still glorious. Carry on. Historians still argue whether certain clothing choices were dictated by gender alone, or if more fluid styles existed in daily Viking life. Some graves have revealed men buried with what we'd now call feminine accessories and vice versa. Were they symbolic personal preferences, a quiet resistance to tunic norms? No one knows for sure, but it's nice to imagine someone strolling through a fjord saying, "Yes, this silk ribbon is part of my aesthetic." You wrap a woven cloak around your shoulders, fastening it with an iron pin shaped like a wolf's head. It drapes heavily, but it's warm, and it billows dramatically when you walk, which is arguably the main reason to wear it. Function meets flair. You nod, satisfied. Next come the shoes. Contrary to popular belief, they aren't just floppy leather sacks. Viking shoes were usually made of stitched-together hide, soft-soled, and cut to fit the shape of your feet. Some even had toggles or drawstrings to keep snow from sneaking in. You slide them on, hoping today won't involve too many puddles or surprise geese. Those little feathered devils know no fear. You step out again, properly layered, ready to face the day. The village is humming with quiet activity. In one corner, a woman spins wool on a drop spindle, hands deft and rhythmic. Nearby, a boy attempts to untangle a pair of leg wraps, now bound into a knot so intense it could summon spirits. You help him undoing it with the patience of someone who's done this 100 times, and may do it 100 more. Another gust of wind swirls dried leaves across the ground, and you instinctively pull your cloak tighter. You pass by a neighbor hanging freshly dyed fabric to dry, brilliant streaks of madder red and woad blue dancing in the breeze like medieval laundry flags. She waves and you wave back with the easy camaraderie of people who've shared many cold winters and probably traded firewood for smoked fish at least twice. You catch the scent of something sweet in the air, honey cakes baking maybe, or mead warming by the hearth. Hard to say. Both are common on cold days when comfort is currency, and anything that tastes vaguely of warmth is considered a blessing. At the market square, someone is offering thread spun from dyed wool, striking against the gray sky. You pause, admiring the purples, deep blues, and even a soft pink. Vikings weren't afraid of color. Neither are you. You buy a skein for no real reason other than the fact that it matches the stitching on your tunic, and frankly, you deserve it. You return to your house with your prize, tuck it into a chest, and consider starting a small embroidery project later. Maybe something simple. Or maybe a dramatic wall hanging declaring, "This house survived winter with style." You sit by the fire, warming your hands. The tunic's sleeves ride up just enough to reveal your wool undershirt, scratchy, dependable, and eternally mismatched at the cuffs. You remember patching it with leftover fabric from an old apron, now long gone. You smile at the memory. The stitches are crooked, but they hold. Someone walks by your window whistling a song that's probably older than the village itself. You lean your head back, eyes closed, soaking in the moment. It's peaceful here, practical, and weirdly fashionable considering everyone's armed and regularly discusses raids like weekend plans. Your boots are muddy, your cloak smells faintly of pine, and your belt pouch has just the right number of walnuts to qualify as a snack, but not a meal. It's going to be a good day. You stretch your arms, the weight of the wool cloak shifting across your shoulders like a sleepy cat, and step outside once again. The sun is higher now, still pale and reserved, like it's unsure if it really wants to commit to this whole shining thing. But the air is a little warmer and your breath doesn't puff quite as dramatically anymore. You head toward the stream. It's not just for drinking or cleaning fish guts, though it sees plenty of both. It's also your go-to source for laundry day, which is today. Yes, even Vikings had laundry day. Somewhere in the vast, blood-soaked image of axe-wielding berserkers, history tends to skip over the part where someone had to scrub mud out of socks. Mainstream fact. Viking households maintained surprisingly regular cleaning and laundry routines. They didn't have soap like we do, but they used lye, a kind of alkaline solution made from ash and water, to clean clothes. Lye doesn't smell like lavender, but it gets the job done, especially if you don't want to smell like you live inside a goat. You drop your bundle by the water, unraveling shirts and tunics, stiff with last week's chores. There's a method to this one you learned watching your mother rinse and twist and rinse again until her hands were red from cold. You plunge your arms into the stream and it bites back like an over-enthusiastic eel. You gasp. The cold is rude but invigorating, like licking a glacier. You begin scrubbing. Fabric against rocks swish and twist, fold and beat. Not glamorous, but there's a rhythm to it, a quiet satisfaction. Each tunic gradually returns to its normal state, free of sweat, fish scales, or whatever unidentifiable stain that is. You choose not to think about it. Best not to ask. You remember how Viking women often used fragrant herbs like thyme or juniper tucked into garments or storage chests to ward off musty smells and moths. You've done the same. You'll pack everything later with sweet gale leaves because you're not about to walk around smelling like wet dog. You do have standards. Fringe, tidbit. Some historians think Vikings bleached their clothing using sun exposure and snow. Yes, snow. As in, they'd literally spread garments on top of it to let sunlight reflect upward and gently lift the colors. It's unclear how effective it was, or whether it was a full-on style choice, or just desperation. But you picture it now, half the village's clothes flopped across a snowy field like colorful seal pups, and someone nearby muttering, "This is the good snow, premium brightening snow." The scholar part of your brain hums gently, as you wonder historians still argue whether laundry duties fell exclusively to women or if men shared the work too. Some sagas imply that everyone pitched in while others leaned toward traditional divisions of labor. Honestly, you're just happy that at least one person in history had the good sense to say, this tunic smells like disappointment. Let's fix that. Suddenly a splash someone upstream. You glance up to see a boy tossing water at his brother, who shrieks and flails in mock horror. Their mother shouts something about freezing lungs and future consequences, but she's laughing too. It's a scene you've seen before, 100 variations over time. Cold water, warm hearts, soggy trousers. Your hands ache now, pink from cold and wrinkled like raisins. You wring out the last shirt and hang it on a low branch pinned with a carved wooden clamp. You scan the pile. Clean, sort of damp, definitely better than before. As you sit by the bank drying your hands with a bit of fur, your thoughts drift to the greater logistics of keeping clothes in good shape. in a world with no zippers, no polyester, and no laundry detergent pods to accidentally eat. Viking textiles were mostly wool and linen, sometimes hemp. Durable, yes, but they needed care. Your grandmother once told you how clothes were inherited, patched, reworked. A child's tunic becomes a vest becomes a pouch becomes stuffing, maybe. Viking recycling centuries before green hashtags, nothing wasted. You admire that even as you pull a stray thread from your sleeve. A neighbor joins you by the stream with her own pile of clothes. She nods in greeting, and the two of you share the kind of conversation where most of the words are shrugs, eye rolls, and sympathetic sighs. Laundry is universal. 1,000 years later, someone somewhere will still be standing by a washing machine, wondering where the other sock went. You head back home, the wet clothes bundled into a basket, still steaming faintly from their cold bath. The path is familiar, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. You pass a tree with carvings in the bark runes, marking someone's love or maybe their livestock count. You can't quite tell. Viking graffiti is an art form. Back inside, the fire welcomes you like an old friend. You hang the damp clothes from a crossbeam, spacing them just so. Too close and they'll mildew. Too far and they'll be stiff as boards by morning. You pour yourself a horn of warm mead. Just a little. You've earned it. You sip as you watch the garments sway slightly in the heat shadows flickering across them like lazy ghosts. There's something deeply cozy about the scene. Clean clothes, warm fire, you, alive, dry, cozy. You remember one saga where a warrior paused mid-battle to fix his cloak clasp. People think that's unrealistic, but honestly, if you've ever tried fighting with a draft on your shoulders, you'd understand. Function before fury. A small crash interrupts your thought, a shirt falling from its perch. You pick it up, hang it again, this time securing it with an extra pin. Nothing gets left behind. Not in this house, not on laundry day. You lean back on the wooden bench, the woven cushion beneath you pressing into your legs with a satisfying firmness. It's mid-afternoon now, that sweet golden slice of the day, when things slow down not because there's nothing to do, but because everyone agrees it can wait an hour. Outside, the wind nudges the drying shirts like it's testing their resilience. You decide to get a little grooming in. After all, just because you're surrounded by mud sheep and fish gut stew doesn't mean you should walk around looking like a weather-beaten log. You reach into a leather pouch and pull out your grooming tools, a small, ornately carved comb, a pair of bone tweezers, and a bit of polished metal you use as a mirror, though it mostly reflects a blurrier, shinier version of your face, like you're always seeing yourself in soft focus. Mainstream fact: Vikings were known for their grooming. Archaeologists have found countless grooming tools in burial sites: combs, ear spoons, razors, tweezers. They cared about appearance probably more than most people assume. In fact, contemporary Christian monks often complained that Viking men were too clean and washed every Saturday, which by medieval standards was basically decadent spa behavior. You tug the comb through your hair slowly. It's thick, a little tangled from the wind, but not too bad. You oiled it last week with a mixture of goose fat and birch resin, and while it smelled a bit like woodland bacon, it left your locks silky smooth. Priorities. You consider braiding it today, maybe one down the side or a quick knot in the back. Your fingers know the patterns. Over, under, twist, loop. It's meditative. Braiding isn't just practical. It keeps hair from falling in your soup or catching on your sword hilt. Again, priorities. But it's also an expression of style. Not flashy, not loud, but unmistakably you. Quirky tidbit. Some Viking combs were so intricately decorated, you wonder if the owner ever actually used them or just whipped them out at gatherings like, "Oh, this old thing, it's whalebone, got it in Hedeby." The Viking version of designer handbags, maybe. Outside, you hear a soft knock and a voice calling. A cousin stopping by to borrow lye, or maybe just gossip. You gesture them in and hand over a pinch of ash mixture making small talk about someone's escaped goat and someone else's suspiciously frequent visits to the healer's hut. Scandalous. You both know it's probably just a rash, but where's the fun in that? As they leave, you return to your reflection. It's not much, but your face is centered now, framed by smooth braids and faint firelight. You run a finger along your jawline where your beard is just beginning to come in. You're considering shaping it soon, maybe a forked style, like your uncle wore before he lost half of it in a cooking accident. Hot stew, low-hanging beard, a cautionary tale. And now the tweezers. Not for fashion necessarily, but for those tiny splinters you pick up while working wood or pulling fibers. You examine your hand, 2 fingers marked one small sliver just beneath the skin. A quick pinch, and it's gone. Painful, yes, but oddly satisfying, like popping bubble wrap, but ancient. Historians still argue whether Viking grooming habits were universal or more common among wealthier or coastal communities. Some scholars point out that inland farmers may not have had access to the same tools or the same social pressure to look neat. You wonder about that. Does someone deep in the forest comb their hair as often as someone near the harbor where every other house doubles as a fashion runway made of mud? Your grandmother used to say a tidy beard makes for clear thinking. You suspect that was her way of telling your grandfather to stop scratching it during meals, but the wisdom stands. You reach for your scent pouch, another underrated grooming essential. Inside dried thyme, rosemary, and a few shavings of amber. You rub a bit on your wrists, not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because smelling faintly of forest herbs is just nice, like walking around wrapped in a cozy fog. And now comes the most Viking part of your grooming ritual, checking your boots. Not for style, but for function. You pull them off, inspect the soles. The stitching is holding up. The fur lining inside rabbit you think is still plush. You rub in a bit of fat to keep the leather soft, because nobody likes frostbitten toes no matter how fearsome they're supposed to be. You remember a festival last spring when everyone showed up in their best. It was a sensory overload: furs, embroidered tunics, polished jewelry, and hair so well coiffed you could practically see your reflection in it. You danced, ate too much roasted elk, and may or may not have sung a questionable song about a goat that couldn't find love. Style clearly has always gone hand in hand with ridiculousness. The fire crackles beside you, warming your side. You lean back, grooming tools resting in your lap, and feel a sleepy kind of pride. You're clean. Your hair is neat. Your tunic doesn't smell like despair. This is what victory feels like. Not the kind they write sagas about, but maybe they should. You hear someone laugh outside, the sound carrying across the field like a ripple of warmth. Evening is coming, but there's still time before dinner. Maybe you'll go walk by the shore or check on your neighbor's new loom setup. Or let's be honest, just take a nap right here, surrounded by the comforting scent of thyme and wood smoke, and the knowledge that if the gods struck you down now, at least you'd die well groomed. You stir from your cushion limbs, warm and pleasantly heavy from the afternoon lull, and the smell of that thyme-scented pouch still faintly lingers on your sleeve. Outside, the light has softened, no longer bright and commanding, but gentler like a flame through gauze. You reach for your cloak, a woven thing, with deep red edging that flutters dramatically behind you, which is entirely the point. Time to pay a visit to the local dyer, not because you need anything really, but because watching someone boil vats of weird-smelling plants into fashion is strangely satisfying. Also, last time you swore you'd return the chunk of woad you borrowed and never used, mostly because it stained your fingers a shade of Smurf blue you weren't quite ready to commit to. Mainstream fact. Viking clothing wasn't all grim grays and dirt browns like Hollywood loves to imply. In reality, woolen fabrics were dyed in bold hues, deep reds from madder root, golden yellows from weld, and blues from woad. The wealthier you were, the more saturated your garments might be, since vibrant dyes were expensive and time-consuming to produce. The dyer's hut smells predictably like hot vinegar-wet moss, and whatever optimism remains after spending all day hunched over boiling cauldrons. You duck inside, greeted by a cheery, soot-faced artisan who waves you toward a series of hanging tunics, all in various stages of transformation from sad beige to glorious mustard. You trade a few pleasantries while pretending not to breathe too deeply. The dyer is stirring a cauldron with the energy of someone who knows their work is both thankless and vital. You hand them the unused chunk of woad and they raise an eyebrow, probably because it's the size of a toddler's fist and still wrapped in sheep gut. You smile awkwardly and pretend that's totally how it's meant to be stored. Quirky tidbit. Some Viking communities reportedly used fermented urine to set dyes into fabric. Yes, P. The ammonia helped the dye bind better. You look at the steaming vat in the corner and make a silent promise to never ask what's in it. Best just to assume it's love and science and move on. You step outside with a scrap of newly dyed cloth ochre yellow, warm and cheerful, and hold it up to the light. It glows like bottled sunshine. This'll make a nice new sash, or maybe just something to twirl casually when you're trying to look breezy in front of your crush. Not that you have a crush. Definitely not. That one blacksmith's apprentice just happens to be in your thoughts a normal amount. Completely normal. Historians still argue whether bright clothing among Vikings signaled wealth, tribal identity, or just a personal sense of flair. Some argue that color was used to stand out in battle, while others think it was all about daily life practical markers of role mood or marriage status. You wonder which you prefer, battle-ready rainbow or cozy domestic palette. You stroll back through the village, passing bundles of dyed yarn flapping on lines like sleepy, colorful flags. The wind makes them dance, casting moving shadows on the ground. Someone's goat escapes nearby again, and a small child chases it with the exasperated sigh of someone who's clearly done this before. You pause by a patch of nettles, not because you're into pain, but because you remember nettles can be used for textile fiber. It's the sort of thing your grandmother would do, turn a stinging weed into something soft and wearable, all while muttering about how the earth gives what it must not, what you want. You pluck a stalk anyway. Maybe you'll try your hand at spinning it later, or give up halfway and just make tea. Back home, you rummage through your chest for your other tunics. There's the blue one with the hole you keep forgetting to mend, the forest green one that makes your shoulders look good, the off-white under-tunic that's seen better days and possibly witnessed crimes. You run your hand over the fabric, feeling for signs of wear, remembering which dye baths each one endured. You toss a few garments over your arm and head to the well. Time to rinse, scrub, and beat the winter out of them. Laundry Viking style involves a fair bit of elbow grease. The trick is not to think of it as a chore, but as rhythmic therapy with water and rocks. You dunk the first tunic into a bucket, swish it around with soapwort, a foamy little plant with surprisingly good cleaning power, and start scrubbing. The sound is kind of lovely. Water sloshing, fabric thumping, distant birds doing whatever birds do at twilight. Your hands sting in the cold water, but in that refreshing, I'm surviving the Iron Age kind of way. There's a peacefulness to it, the kind of peace that comes not from sitting still, but from doing something simple and useful. You think about colors again, how much they change a person, how even a drab, muddy morning can feel different if your sleeves are saffron yellow or your belt is crimson red. You think maybe the Vikings didn't just dye fabric for vanity, but as a defense against the long winters, a bit of color to warm the eyes when the world outside turned gray. You hang your freshly scrubbed tunics over a branch, droplets catching the last of the sun like tiny beads. It smells like lye soapwort and a little bit of wet sheep, but in a good way. You sit beside them and stretch out your legs, watching the colors sway with the breeze. You remember the dyer saying that the right mixture of moss and iron could turn cloth a beautiful soft green. You made a mental note. Green seems calming. Maybe you need more green in your wardrobe. Your cloak slips off one shoulder and you adjust it casually, not because anyone is watching, but just in case. You look good in a rugged, slightly smells of fermented plant matter kind of way. You wake to the soft creaking of wooden rafters above your head and the unmistakable scent of someone baking bread far too early. The tunics you left drying last night still hang outside now, a little stiff with morning frost, and somehow smelling both fresher and more like damp moss than you remember. You wrap yourself in your woolen cloak, scratch at your neck absent-mindedly, and remember something mildly horrifying. It's louse-combing day. Mainstream fact: Vikings were surprisingly meticulous about hygiene and grooming, especially when it came to hair. Combs were among the most common personal items found in graves, often elaborately carved from antler or bone. A well-maintained beard or braid wasn't just vanity, it was status ritual and maybe a tiny bit flirtation. You retrieve your comb from a leather pouch. It's smooth and worn down at the edges, shaped like a tiny bridge. You begin carefully drawing it through your hair, starting at the ends, and working upward like your mother taught you, because unless you enjoy self-inflicted scalp trauma, that's the only civilized way. Fringe fact: some Viking combs came in double-toothed designs, not unlike what modern pet groomers use, one side for detangling, the other for catching lice. It's a little too effective, actually. You spot something suspicious clinging to the teeth and mutter a few words that, while not profane, are still unprintable in polite company. The wind creeps under the doorframe as you sit near the fire, grooming lazily and listening to the slow hiss of damp logs. You begin braiding your hair tight at the crown, looser near the ends, and add a tiny copper bead near your temple. It's just decorative, but let's be honest, you look fierce. You imagine yourself stepping into a longhouse full of admirers. The crowd parts. Someone gasps. Who is that well-combed vision? It's you. Of course it's you. Historians still argue whether Viking hairstyles signified tribe trade or simply personal flair. There's evidence that men and women alike wore elaborate braids, ponytails, and even shaved sections. Some scholars think styles were regional, while others argue they changed with the seasons, shorter in battle months, longer during feasting seasons. You brush a loose strand from your cheek and decide, whatever the reason, the goal was obvious. Look like you meant business. Even if the business was just foraging and occasional dramatic storytelling. Outside, the village is slowly stirring. Someone leads a pig down the path, muttering like the pig just insulted their cooking. Kids tumble past barefoot, impervious to frostbite, because children have no nerve endings, apparently. You walk to the stream with your comb tucked safely in your belt, the braids swaying lightly behind you like a banner of modest self-respect. You pass a woman weaving outside her hut, linen threads stretched tight across a loom that's more tree than tool. She nods as you walk past her hands, never stopping. Her hair is up in a style you've seen before, braided on both sides with a loop at the crown. It looks regal, practical, and aerodynamic. You help her for a moment just to feel useful. She lets you beat the weft with a heavy wooden sword-shaped tool. It's satisfying in the way vacuuming is. Lines appear, things are tidy, the universe makes sense again. Quirky tidbit: some Vikings carried grooming kits attached to their belts, complete with tweezers, ear scoops, and tiny razors. Imagine pulling out a fashionable bronze earwax scraper at a feast. Conversation starter and hygiene hero. You run a hand through your braid again. Still smooth. You've earned a morning stroll. The trail past the stream leads you into the birch woods, where the ground crunches beneath your boots and the trees sway like sleepy dancers. Your fingers absently twist the end of your braid as you walk, partly to keep your hands warm, partly out of habit. There's a certain peace that comes with grooming rituals, something primal and grounding. You think of the old warriors not just wielding axes, but pausing to oil their beards with goose fat or tie back their hair Before battle, not because it's cute, but because clarity of face equals clarity of mind, or at least less hair in your mouth. You reach a small clearing with rocks arranged in a circle, an old fire pit maybe. You sit, undo your braid, and start again slower this time. You twist separate and fold each section carefully like it's a spell. You hum something tuneless. It feels ancient, like this moment could be happening 1,000 years ago or tomorrow afternoon, and no one would know the difference. You laugh suddenly, out loud, because you realize how many hours the average Viking probably spent brushing out tangles and snapping off the occasional lice comb tooth only for modern media to paint them as wild-haired berserkers who never once considered conditioner. The injustice. Back at your longhouse, someone is heating a kettle. You pop your head in just long enough to ask if they've got any mint left for scalp rinse. They toss you a bundle dried and tied with twine. You steep it in a wooden bowl, wait until it cools, and pour it over your hair, shivering and invigorated and slightly smug. Your scalp thanks you. Later, around the central hearth, you and a few others sit chatting about wool Waite's goose migration and whether or not Sigurd from across the fjord actually makes his own beard oil or just claims he does to impress visitors. Consensus, it's probably just bacon grease. Someone compliments your braid. You nod solemnly and say, "The comb was strong today." They laugh. You tuck the compliment into your mental chest like a new bead. Maybe tomorrow you'll try something more ambitious, a fishtail braid or even double knots, if your arms don't fall asleep halfway through. The fire crackles, your hair steams gently from the rinse, and your comb rests beside your cloak. You feel clean, well coiffed, and deeply inexplicably satisfied. Because for all the raids and sagas, maybe what made the Vikings feel human, feel real, wasn't the epic stuff. It was this, sitting near a fire, smoothing out the tangles and enjoying the simple triumph of not smelling like fermented herring. The morning hum fades into the rhythmic thud of wool being beaten. You're back in the longhouse, hunched beside a low bench, watching someone expertly full a newly woven tunic. Basically, they're whacking the daylights out of it until it decides to become softer and warmer. It's oddly satisfying, almost like laundry, if laundry involved more punching and fewer detergent pods. Mainstream fact Viking winter wear was almost entirely wool-based, and for good reason. Wool insulates even when wet, making it a cold-weather miracle. From thick cloaks to inner-layer tunics, wool was the backbone of staying alive and fashionably toasty during Scandinavian winters that could freeze your eyebrows clean off. You finger the edge of a cloak draped nearby, its weave, tight and deliberate. It smells faintly of sheep and wood smoke. The dye is a warm ochre color, probably onion skins or birch bark. You smile, thinking how every time someone compliments it, they're technically admiring soup byproduct. Chic. Outside, the day is gray and lazy. The air has that crisp bread texture where your breath fogs instantly and your nose starts reevaluating its life choices. You throw the wool cloak around your shoulders, grab a felted hood, and step out into the muffled quiet of winter boots, crunching softly on a path edged with frost. Fringe fact. Some Viking cloaks were closed with simple bone pins, but others featured elaborate bronze brooches shaped like dragons or abstract spirals. Not just a fastener, basically the historical equivalent of a statement necklace. "Look at me," the brooch says. "I'm cold, but make it fashion." You trudge toward the loom hut where today's real magic happens. A few women are working inside their hands, moving quickly as they pass wooden shuttles back and forth through stretched threads. You duck through the doorway, already feeling the dry warmth from the hearth and the distinct tang of lanolin sheep oil that clings to raw wool like a clumsy but loving pet. They welcome you with nods and the offer of a spindle, which you politely decline. You're here to observe, not to accidentally tangle 6 months' worth of yarn and become a footnote in someone's angry oral saga. Historians still argue whether Viking textiles were mostly home-crafted or if there was a dedicated class of professional weavers, especially when it came to those impressively patterned tapestries and finer cloaks found in elite burials. Some even debate whether certain symbols woven into fabrics held spiritual or clan significance, or were just cool-looking doodles spun by someone bored during a long winter. One woman, older and wise-eyed, shows you a cloak she's finishing. It's been fulled, brushed, and trimmed with a contrasting border of red wool that makes it pop like Viking haute couture. She gestures to the shears heavy iron things with a bite like a wolf's jaw and snips a loose thread with surgical precision. Then, just for fun, she hands you a wooden carding brush and points toward a pile of wool that looks like a cloud had a nervous breakdown. You try brushing the raw fibers, pulling them apart and aligning them with gentle strokes. It's soothing, like petting a particularly needy sheep. You chat about the weather, about how your boots still leak slightly despite being stuffed with moss, and whether next year's wool will be thicker if the ewes keep sneaking into the fermented barley stores. Probably not, but it's fun to imagine tipsy sheep stumbling around in sweaters they haven't grown yet. Later, you help dye a few skeins of yarn. Today's batch is walnut brown, rich and earthy. The pot bubbles over a small fire, steam rising in spirals like a lazy ghost. You stir with a stick and wonder how many color experiments began with a simple, well, let's see what happens if we boil this root. Joke number 2 of the section arrives right on cue when someone dares you to wear the neon yellow tunic someone dyed last week, using lichen and stale urine. You raise an eyebrow, accept the dare, and put it on. It's bright, like so bright. You look like a fashionable sunbeam, which might be the only sun Scandinavia gets in January anyway. As the day softens toward dusk, you return to your longhouse to find someone crafting a new woolen hat. It's squat-ribbed and almost aggressively practical. You try it on and are immediately 10% warmer and 20% smugger. There's a small embroidered spiral on one side. Maybe it means good luck, or maybe the maker was just spiraling mentally halfway through the stitch count. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists found Viking-era mittens with built-in finger slits, kind of like the original texting gloves. Not so much fashion-forward as free the thumb, but still you have to respect the innovation. You wrap yourself in your newly adopted cloak, now properly broken in, and sit by the hearth sipping a warm broth. Steam curls from the wooden bowl as the fire crackles and your fingers begin working the hem of your tunic, checking for loose stitches. You hum a tune about frost giants being thwarted by itchy wool pants, and someone else joins in without asking. Harmony achieved. You lean back, eyes heavy, wool layers hugging you like sleepy sheep. The thought occurs to you, maybe warmth wasn't just a necessity for Vikings. Maybe it was a lifestyle, a rebellion against the ice, a woven shield made of 10,000 tiny threads dyed in laughter and stubbornness, and possibly onion skins. You crouch beneath the low beams of a timber hall, the air thick with the scent of smoke wool and something vaguely herbal, maybe juniper, maybe just damp socks and fermented fish. The hearth crackles in the center, its glow flickering across a row of seated figures working quietly with combs, knives, and scraps of animal horn. No battle cries here, no oaths to Odin, just the delicate art of crafting grooming tools Viking style. You've made it to the part of the evening where things get surprisingly domestic and pointy. The humble comb, yes comb, held near religious significance in Viking daily life. You might think of it as the ancient Norse version of carrying floss in your back pocket. Crafted from a bone, antler, or wood, these combs were intricately carved, sometimes decorated with knot patterns and animal heads. They weren't just utilitarian, they were statements. Like flexing with a beard trimmer in a village where the next best option is a river and your own fingernails. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of combs across Viking sites, from burial mounds to trading centers like Birka and Hedeby. And the detail in some of these combs, absolutely extra. Multiple rows of teeth decorative inlays, sometimes even stored in their own carved boxes or sheaths slung from belts. You might be picturing a travel toiletry kit, and you're not wrong. The craftsmanship didn't stop at the comb itself. Bone-working workshops like the ones found in Dublin's Viking Quarter suggest entire cottage industries dedicated to grooming tool production. It's possible scholars think that these artisans were the Viking equivalent of boutique Etsy sellers peddling handmade grooming kits to upwardly mobile raiders. But historians still argue whether combs were purely personal hygiene tools or had ritual significance, maybe even used in rites or ceremonies. Could brushing your beard before a raid be a spiritual act, or was it just about not smelling like low tide? And it wasn't just combs. Tweezers, ear picks, and nail cleaners, sometimes bundled together like Swiss Army grooming kits, also pop up in grave goods and personal carry pouches. That's right. The same culture that gave us berserkers also gave us the pocket manicure set. Multitudes, my friend. Vikings contained multitudes. There's a fringe theory floating around that some of the more elaborate combs weren't actually meant for everyday use. Instead, they may have been status symbols never meant to touch a strand of hair, much like the designer sneakers that never leave their box. This, of course, clashes with the evidence of wear and tear on many surviving examples, but who doesn't love a good mystery? In one burial in Sweden, a man was laid to rest with no fewer than 3 combs. Either he ran a grooming business on the side, or he was just really, really into hair. Speaking of hair, let's talk about Viking hairstyles, because all these combs must have had a purpose, right? The classic image of wild, unkempt hair flying in the wind is more Hollywood than historical. In reality, Viking men and women braided, trimmed, and styled their hair with care, often in practical yet stylish arrangements. Men typically wore short hair at the back and sides with a longer top, kind of like the world's first undercut. Women, meanwhile, wore their hair long, often braided or pinned up with ornate hair sticks or beads. Those weren't just accessories. They were tiny, sparkling declarations of status and regional flair. And it wasn't just head hair. Viking men groomed their beards meticulously. The beard wasn't just a facial feature. It was a canvas. Trimmed, shaped, oiled with animal fat or herbal salves, it signaled age, strength, and yes, sometimes sheer fabulousness. You imagine reaching for your own bone comb now, sitting cross-legged in a smoky hall while someone across from you haggles over the price of a new pair of tweezers. You're not sure whether this qualifies as peaceful domesticity or just a slower form of battle, but either way, it's oddly comforting. Oh, and while we're here, lice combs, yes, those existed too. Some combs with super fine teeth seem custom-made for the unpleasant but necessary task of delousing. Call it preventative Viking pest control. Nothing says intimacy like letting someone go bug hunting in your braid. Remember that flaxen-haired Viking from earlier? With the fancy soap, he probably had a favorite comb, one he refused to lend out, even to his closest shipmate, because in a world of ever-changing alliances and surprise weather, some things should remain sacred, like personal grooming tools. And as you recline in your imagined longhouse, listening to the crackling hearth and the scrape of horn against bone, you can't help but appreciate the quiet determination it must have taken to carve a perfect symmetrical comb. No electric tools, no sandpaper, just skill time and a steady hand. Not all heroes wield swords, some wield bone-carving knives and an eye for symmetry. You sit back now, watching the soft golden firelight catch on something a little shinier, metal, glass, even bits of amber. The Vikings, you realize, didn't just comb their hair and beard with obsessive flair. They dressed for the weather, sure, but they also dressed to impress. Tonight, you're going to wade into the world of Viking textiles, those warm, cozy layers that had to endure wind off the fjords, the chill of sea spray, and probably the occasional goose attack. You know, the usual threats. It starts with wool. Glorious, scratchy, sturdy wool. Sheep were basically four-legged fabric machines to the Vikings, especially the Old Norse short-tailed sheep, a breed hardy enough to survive the Scandinavian winters and cooperative enough to give up their fleece once a year. The wool was spun by hand into yarn, often by women using drop spindles, which, fun fact, look like ancient fidget toys, but could also determine whether your family froze or flourished through winter. Once spun, the wool was woven on upright looms into cloth, typically coarse but warm. Think blanket meets tunic. And those tunics, they weren't just brown potato sacks. Vikings loved bright colors, reds, yellows, greens, blues. Natural dyes came from plants, lichens, even crushed bugs. That's right, you might be wearing beetle juice and onion peels, and somehow it looked fantastic. Historians still argue whether color choices were mainly practical, symbolic, or status-based. Did the chieftain wear red because it made him look fierce, or just because it showed he could afford the rarest dye? And were darker, plainer clothes a mark of humility, or just an accident of geography? And then there were patterns. Viking weavers incorporated check stripes and even diamond shapes into their fabrics. These patterns weren't just decorative, they were identity markers, hints at region rank, and maybe even clan, like a Norse tartan minus the bagpipes. Fringe. Theory time, some scholars believe certain weaving patterns had magical properties, protective symbolism stitched right into the cloth. Whether or not that's true, you do start to feel kind of invincible in a hooded wool tunic with embroidered trim. But let's layer up. Over the tunic, you'd wear a cloak fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. Not just any brooch, though. These were chunky, ornate, often made of bronze, silver, or occasionally gold. Some were so detailed you could spend a full 10 minutes just staring at the little animal heads biting their own tails. Did people notice if your cloak pin was last year's model? Almost certainly. You might even have a cloak lined with fur. Squirrel, fox, or bear, depending on what was local and legal. Nothing screams winter like I'm wearing something that could have eaten me last week. Cozy, terrifying, and on-trend. Footwear functional. Soft leather shoes or boots, tied with laces or toggles, were the norm. In wet weather, some folks stuffed their shoes with hay for insulation. It's basically Viking memory foam, but comfier. Maybe. No guarantees. Let's not forget undergarments. Yes, even here Vikings had layers. Linen was preferred when available, often imported or made from painstakingly processed flax. Picture someone spending days smashing plants with a mallet just so they could sew underpants. That's dedication. For the record, women's clothing was equally detailed, if not more so. A typical Norse woman wore a linen shift, a wool dress called a smocker, and over that a decorated apron dress held up by, wait for it, tortoise brooches. Not made of actual tortoise, sadly, but shaped like a shell. These brooches held up straps, sure, but also supported strings of beads, amulets, and tiny grooming tools. Practical jewelry, basically. The Viking version of a Swiss Army necklace. Children were dressed in smaller versions of adult clothing, though probably less adorned unless your toddler happened to be the heir to a jarlship. And yes, kids wore little wool cloaks too. Somewhere there's a Viking version of a baby photo, a 2-year-old wrapped in wool, snotty-nosed and stubbornly refusing to wear their squirrel fur mittens. You picture yourself now decked out in layers of hand-woven wool, a brooch gleaming at your shoulder, your shoes crunching lightly over frozen grass. You feel the warmth of the fabric, the way it shields you from wind and salt. And you wonder, not for the first time, how they made all this look so effortless. Historians still can't agree on how exactly Viking clothes were cut. Few full garments survive, and pattern reconstructions vary wildly. Was that tunic knee-length or thigh-length? Did cloaks close left over right, or vice versa? You can practically hear the quiet academic bickering. But what everyone does agree on is, this Viking clothing was not crude. It was crafted, durable, adaptable, often beautiful, whether for warmth, for ceremony, or just to feel fancy during the monthly thing assembly. And somewhere in all that wool and linen, there's a message: survive first. But if you can survive in style, so much the better. Now that you're all bundled up in your imaginary woolen layers, warmed by the thought of hay-insulated shoes and tortoise-shaped brooches, it's time to turn to something equally practical: Viking homes. Those low, elongated havens against snowstorms, and let's face it, the occasional axe-wielding neighbor. You stand at the threshold of a longhouse. The roof slopes down like a protective arm, thick with turf and moss, and smoke curls gently from a hole in the top like a lazy dragon stretching in the cold. These homes weren't built for grandeur. They were built to keep wind out and heat in, comfort over Instagram appeal. A typical Viking longhouse was about 15 to 75 feet long, made of wood if trees were nearby, or stone and turf if not. Wood was a luxury, so in Iceland and Greenland you might be more turf than timber, literally living in a grassy rectangle. Step inside, mind your head. The ceiling's low and the beams feel ancient even when freshly cut. The floor packed earth, walls insulated with woven wattle or moss-stuffed crevices. It's not glamorous, but you're shielded from the wind, and there's a steady crackle from the central hearth. That hearth is the beating heart of the home, used for cooking, warmth, and the occasional storytelling session, or drying your socks after a wet raid. Historians still argue whether Viking homes had chimneys or if the smoke simply filtered out through the roof hole. Based on how many charred roof timbers we've found, let's just say Viking air quality was rustic. You wander toward the side benches, raised platforms that doubled as beds and seating. Families often slept together in these communal arrangements, huddled under thick furs and woolen blankets. Cozy or cramped, depends how much Uncle Bjorn snored. Personal space was a flexible concept. A typical household might include parents, kids, grandparents, hired farmhands, possibly a thrall or two, enslaved people, sadly common in Viking society, and a dog who's somehow the only one with its own corner. Despite the crowd, the space was organized. There were dedicated areas for spinning, weaving, tool repair, even food prep. Meat might hang from the rafters to dry, grain stored in bins, butter churned in the corner like it had all day to gossip. And the decorations don't imagine barren walls. Vikings liked carvings, painted wood, and ornamented tools. A spoon might have more flair than your modern silverware set. A chest would feature iron inlays. Beauty and function walked hand in hand, even in a society where function had to wear fur boots. One fringe theory suggests certain carvings near doorways had protective purposes, runes to keep out spirits or jealous neighbors. Whether that worked is unclear. You suspect it did little to stop people from borrowing tools they forgot to return for 5 winters straight. Now picture winter in full swing. The snow outside is deep enough to lose a goat kiss in, but in here the hearth glows and the smell of fish, stew, onions, and something vaguely herbal floats through the air. Someone's mending a cloak in the corner. Kids bicker softly over a wooden game board. There's a kind of peace, a rhythm to life that's dictated by the fire's crackle and the softness of wool against skin. And yes, the longhouse occasionally stank, of smoke, of wet wool, of unwashed feet. But it was home. It was safety. Outside, smaller outbuildings clutter the yard sheds for tools, stables for animals, maybe a sauna if you're in Scandinavia proper. Yes, Vikings loved saunas. Heated stone steam and a quick roll in the snow. Think of it as Nordic self-care before it was cool, literally. As you tiptoe into the steamy little outbuilding, you realize that cleanliness mattered more to Vikings than pop culture gives them credit for. Archaeological digs often turn up tweezers, nail cleaners, even ear spoons. That's right, ear spoons. The ultimate signal that yes, this axe-wielding raider also values personal hygiene. Historians still debate how often Viking families cleaned themselves fully. weekly only before holidays during moon phases. We'll never know exactly. But clearly they didn't live in squalor, and they likely smelled more like juniper smoke than swamp. Even in the harshest regions, long houses were well planned for survival. In places like Greenland, walls were several feet thick and interior layouts adapted for warmth efficiency. You'd gather livestock inside during the coldest nights. Yes, the sheep shared your house. No, there was no such thing as dander-free. There were seasonal rituals, too. Winter nights meant storytelling, epic sagas, ancestral legends, practical jokes passed down like heirlooms. This was where oral history flourished, sitting in the flickering firelight, voices hushed under the thatch. You wonder what stories echoed here of gods and monsters, heroes and doomed kings, or just that one time Grandpa fell into the goat pen after too much mead. Before you leave the longhouse, run your fingers along the worn grain of the central post. It's smooth from generations of hands, a silent witness to thousands of winter mornings, sleepy arguments, warm meals, and quiet survival. The house was more than shelter. It was the backdrop of Viking life, the container for its memories, and it smelled like a cross between stew, wet dog, and warm pine. Not so different from your uncle's cabin, really. With the smoky coziness of the longhouse still clinging to your imagination like the scent of wood smoke in your hair, you step outside, wrapped of course in several woolen layers, maybe even a bit of otter fur if you're feeling bold, and take a deep breath of the crisp Scandinavian air. Your destination now, the daily rhythms that filled Viking life when they weren't busy raiding or posing for modern TV shows. Because most of the time, brace yourself, they weren't actually raiding. Shocking, I know. You've been lied to by 1,000 dramatic reenactments. In truth, Vikings spent a significant portion of their lives farming. You squint at the low winter sun as it skims across the horizon. The light's gold, but the warmth a lie. Still, there's work to be done. You hear the creak of a wooden bucket, the squawk of a very opinionated chicken, and the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting logs. Just another Tuesday in Viking country. Let's start with food. Daily meals were hearty but humble: bread baked on a flat stone porridge made of barley, or oats, boiled vegetables, and stews that simmered for hours over the central hearth. Meat occasionally, fish often, pickled things. A Scandinavian tradition long before hipsters adopted it. A mainstream historical fact here: archaeological finds show Vikings ate surprisingly well. In fact, their diets were relatively balanced, including grains, dairy, vegetables, meat, and fermented goodies. They brewed their own beer and mead, churned butter, and kept bees for honey, though whether those bees were cooperative or just cranky little buzzsaws is left to interpretation. Historians still argue whether Viking diets differed drastically between regions or classes. Did coastal Norwegians eat more cod, while Swedish farmers devoured more root veggies? Did chieftains get extra pickles? The truth might be in some long-forgotten compost heap. As the stew simmers, someone sharpens tools, a vital part of daily life. Farming tools, fishing gear, wood-cutting axes, even textile equipment were maintained constantly. You didn't just hope your scythe worked during harvest. You tested it on innocent patches of grass, like a blade enthusiast at a Renaissance fair. In the workshop, someone is crafting something out of bone, perhaps a button, a comb, or even a tiny amulet. Viking households were often self-sufficient, and repurposing was an art. Nothing went to waste. That sheep rib, it's a soup base now, and later it's a crochet hook. That bit of antler, a belt clasp. Even the concept of trash was a luxury they couldn't afford. And speaking of wool, oh boy, the textiles was strong. Weaving was essential. And you might find someone, often a woman, working a vertical loom, the rhythm of warp and weft, like a meditative chant. Linen from flax wool, from sheep, sometimes dyed with plant-based pigments for a splash of color. There's even evidence that high-status Vikings wore bright clothes, deep blues, saffron yellows, and reds so bold you'd be mistaken for a festival tent. Now, a fringe tidbit: some historians believe Viking textiles were so well crafted that they were used as currency. Imagine paying your taxes with a bolt of plaid. Talk about fashion with financial returns. Children would have had chores: fetching water, collecting eggs, maybe chasing geese away from the cabbage patch. And in the quiet winter days, families gathered to make things: tools, cloth, food, stories. Games helped too. Evidence suggests Vikings played table games similar to chess or hennefetafel. Just try pronouncing that without sounding like you sneezed. These were strategy games involving kings and attackers. They were about cunning, not combat. Yes, the same people who painted shields for battle also pondered chessboard tactics in their downtime. As for music, there are depictions of lyres, flutes, and even drums. While we don't know the exact tunes, one can imagine melodic hums and foot taps echoing through a longhouse on snowy evenings. Folk songs that lived in memory, not sheet music. And while modern folks argue about Spotify ads, Vikings debated, albeit wordlessly, whose turn it was to refill the stew pot. One of the most delightful things about Viking daily life is how normal it was. For every ship that set sail to distant shores, there were 100 people staying home, kneading dough, tending goats, and darning socks. It wasn't all glory and conquest. Mostly it was mud mushrooms and making sure your cow didn't wander into the mead cellar again. Some families had access to imported goods, especially near trade ports: amber beads from the Baltic, silk from the east, maybe a little glassware if you were extra lucky. This brings up another scholarly debate. How much did everyday Vikings engage in international trade? Were exotic goods rare treasures? Or did coastal traders casually sip wine while wearing Persian slippers? Probably somewhere in between, though. The image of a Viking lounging in silk socks is undeniably delightful. Before the sun dips too low, you glance around the farmstead one last time. There's a calm to it, a sturdiness in the routine. Someone's stacking firewood, someone else is repairing a fishing net. Even the cat looks vaguely industrious as it chases something invisible near the hay pile. You duck back into the longhouse, greeted by the rich aroma of broth and a few murmured greetings. Someone passes you a bowl of stew. You sit on a bench warmed by the fire and wrapped in the shared quiet of a day well spent. Outside, snow gathers in soft drifts. Inside, life continues mundane, messy, and beautiful. You stretch your legs a bit beside the fire, letting the warmth seep into your wool-wrapped limbs. The longhouse hums with sleepy comfort, and your belly's full of root vegetable stew that, while not Michelin-starred, has that oddly satisfying flavor of, "I foraged this myself." But as the fire crackles, you start to wonder, what else did these Vikings do when they weren't just boiling onions or trying to outwit goats? Well, friend, it's time we wandered into the more spiritual side of Viking life. Quiet, layered, and very, very snowy. Religion in the Viking world wasn't just about thunder gods and epic quests. It was woven into every mundane moment. You didn't light a fire, take a trip, or even tie your shoes without some gesture to the divine. Shoes, after all, had to be laced properly, or Loki might trip you up both metaphorically and literally. That guy was everywhere. The gods were many, and they weren't always heroic. You had Odin, the Wanderer King, with a thing for ravens and cryptic one-liners. Thor, the loud hammer guy who probably always double-fisted mugs of ale at weddings. Freyja, fierce and radiant. And let's not forget Frigg, Njord, Hel, and an entire supporting cast who'd make even modern soap operas seem underpopulated. Mainstream historical fact: Viking religion was polytheistic and ritual-heavy. Sacrifices animal usually don't panic seasonal feasts, and symbolic offerings were common. You didn't just believe, you acted on that belief. And no, there wasn't a weekly sermon, but a good festival every now and then. Oh, yes. Now here's the quirky bit. Some scholars believe Vikings offered butter to their household spirits. That's right. Not wine, not gold, good old churned dairy. It was placed on threshold stones near hearths, or hidden in little nooks to keep the huldufolk or land spirits happy. Imagine trying to explain to your lactose-intolerant friend why your ancestors bribed elves with dairy products. Historians still argue whether these folk spirits were seen as entirely separate from the gods, or just extensions of them like Odin's neighborhood reps. But what's clear is that Vikings were deeply respectful of nature and the unseen. Forests weren't just forests. That grove behind your house might be sacred. That oddly shaped rock, definitely not just a rock. Possibly a troll with an excellent poker face. The home itself was a spiritual space. The hearth was sacred, the doorpost blessed during key moments. Birth, marriage, illness, even brewing everything had a rite. There's a theory that women held special ritual roles, especially volure seers or prophetesses who performed elaborate ceremonies involving staffs, chants, and possibly hallucinogenic herbs. You know, the usual Friday night. Now don't get too excited. There's debate over how widespread this really was. Some say these were rare priestess types, others argue that lots of women engaged in lower-key magical practices. What's certain is that these rituals helped people feel like they had some say in a very unpredictable world. Magic wasn't rare, it was practical. You might carve runes on a boat for luck, bury a charm near your crops, whisper protective chants before a journey. One famous saga even mentions a man who carved magical runes into a woman's drinking horn to win her affection. Spoiler, it didn't end well. Always get consent before magically enhanced beverages. So what happens when people died? Here's where things get layered. Burials were tailored to the person's status and possibly their vibe. Some were buried in mounds with ships, weapons, even horses. Others got simple cremations and ash scattering. A few lucky or cursed, who knows, were entombed in boats and sent down rivers, though the flaming Viking funeral trope is probably more Hollywood than historical. But even in death, the living maintained a relationship with the departed. People left offerings at graves, spoke to ancestors, and believed their spirits lingered. In fact, some homes were passed down with the expectation that the ghost of Grandma Gudrun might be keeping an eye on the butter stash. The Viking calendar was filled with seasonal festivals. Yule, not just about reindeer and cookies. It marked the winter solstice with feasting, drinking, and toasts to gods, kings, and ancestors. Bloat was another common ritual, sacrifices for fertility, health, or protection. These weren't public PR stunts. They were deeply personal moments where community and cosmos came together. And yes, there were tales of shapeshifters, sorcerers, and those who could walk between worlds. Not everyone trusted them, but everyone respected them, because who wants to offend someone who might turn into a wolf at family dinner? So here you are under thatch, and stars wrapped in fur, listening to a nearby elder whisper. An old saga, part history, part myth, part bedtime story. The air is thick with incense from juniper and the distant scent of something baking for tomorrow's feast. It's easy to romanticize this life. But remember, for all their mysticism and muscle, the Vikings also worried about sick cows, sprained ankles, and whether it was going to snow too early this year. They prayed for good harvests. They gave thanks for small mercies. And they faced the unknown, both divine and daily, with a mix of reverence and practicality. So the next time you walk past a gnarled tree, maybe nod. Just in case. You never know who or what is listening. You're still beside the hearth, though. Now the fire has mellowed into glowing coals, each ember pulsing like a sleepy heartbeat. Outside, wind stirs the snow in lazy spirals, brushing softly against the wooden slats of your Viking home. You feel it in your bones. It's time to settle, to drift toward quiet endings. But before you curl up completely, there's one more seed of Viking life worth exploring. Their surprisingly satisfying relationship with home comforts. Yes, really, we've talked about religion, farming, grooming, and fashion, but let's not forget the Vikings knew how to nest. After all, when half the year is dark, icy, and wildly inconvenient, you learn to make your indoor spaces pretty livable. Let's start with beds. No, they weren't sleeping on hay piles like rustic cartoons. Wealthier Vikings had actual wooden bed frames, often intricately carved and topped with straw-filled mattresses, animal pelts, and woolen blankets. Even the common folk padded out their sleeping spots with moss feathers or layered textiles. It wasn't luxury as we'd define it, but it definitely beat cold planks and existential frostbite. And where did they sleep? Often all together, family guests, even a few animals tucked nearby for warmth. Privacy was a theoretical concept, but community coziness was very real. You'd huddle in the longhouse fire crackling at the center, the smell of cooked fish, wood smoke, and maybe even fresh bread mixing in the rafters. Mainstream historical fact. Viking homes were built with insulation in mind. Turf roofs, double walls packed with mud and straw, low ceilings all designed to keep heat in and the biting wind out. Think of it as ancient Scandinavian passive house design. Earthy, efficient, and refreshingly off-grid. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Some Vikings decorated their homes with carved dragon heads inside. Not just on ships. It wasn't just for flair. Some believed these stylized beasts would ward off evil or impress visiting spirits. Picture your modern kitchen. Now imagine a dragon head in the corner silently judging your sourdough starter. Historians still argue whether these dragons were primarily decorative, magical, or symbolic status flexes. Whatever the reason, they definitely added a bit of flair to otherwise dim, smoky interiors. Vikings masters of the moody Nordic aesthetic before it hit Instagram. But home wasn't all woodwork and warm fuzzies. Vikings had a whole culture around domestic responsibility. There were rhythms to the day, fires to stoke animals, to feed tools, to sharpen, and butter to churn. Yes, churning butter was a real household job, and one that came with songs, rituals, and apparently minor spiritual peril if you did it on a Thursday. Thanks, Loki. Children were expected to help early. A 7-year-old might be mending nets, collecting firewood, or helping grind grain with a heavy circular quernstone. Don't worry, they also had time to play. Toy finds from Viking sites include carved animals, miniature swords, and something that suspiciously resembles a spinning top. Play was practice, as it often is. Evenings were about winding down. There was storytelling, sometimes singing, and believe it or not, a form of board games. Nefatafel, a sort of Viking chess, was wildly popular. It involved strategy bluffing and an attacker versus defender layout. Some historians claim it was used to simulate real battle tactics. Others say it was just a good excuse to avoid dishes. And of course, there was wool. So much wool. Wool to weave into cloaks, to dye with madder root or lichen, to stitch into mittens. Spinning and weaving weren't just tasks. They were generational skills. Looms dominated corner spaces in homes, and the rhythmic clack of weaving was probably as comforting as any lullaby. You sitting beside a woman weaving at night would hear the soft beat of thread and see patterns take form in the glow of oil lamps. It's a sound that lulls. Speaking of oil lamps, lighting in Viking homes was subtle. Candles made from tallow or beeswax lamps carved from soapstone, even the reflective placement of pale stones to amplify whatever meager daylight snuck in, and mirrors rare but not non-existent, often made of polished metal. Not great for selfies, but good enough to make sure your beard wasn't tangled in your soup. There's something very human about all this. A people often remembered for raids and roughness actually spent most of their time weaving, baking, singing, mending, telling stories, and trying to keep goats from chewing the furniture. They kept pets. Yes, there's evidence of dogs and cats, even falcons, and mourned them when they died. They carved hearts into beams and left runes in thresholds saying things like, "Thor bless this house." Honestly, it's adorable. By now the fire's a faint orange pulse, and your breath is slow. You imagine pulling a thick woolen cloak over your shoulders, tucking in beside a sleeping cousin or two, listening to someone snore gently while wind moans past the shutters. A carved dragon stares blankly from the rafters. All is warm, all is quiet. And the last thing you hear before you drift off, not a battle cry, not a storm, just the soft scratch of someone brushing their hair. Because even among warriors, bedtime mattered. And now the hearth has gone dim, the coals barely warm beneath their gray blanket of ash. The longhouse is hushed, its timber bones creaking softly with the settling chill of night. Outside, snow continues its slow whispering fall, muffling the world into a sleepy stillness. You shift beneath a fur blanket, perhaps wolf, perhaps bear, tucked tight against the cold. Everything about this moment invites stillness. Your breath deepens. The tales of wool and bread, of carved combs and dragon-shaped house charms linger like the scent of pine smoke and honeyed mead. You picture your fingers brushing the soft weave of a homespun cloak, feel the flicker of amber light on a clay mug, hear the gentle click of bone game pieces being tucked away for tomorrow. No raids, no roars, just the quiet truth that history at its heart is full of warmth, full of ordinary moments lovingly repeated, and those moments muffed chores by firelight, warm food shared in silence, a carved charm to keep out the dark. Those are what last. Those are what soothe. Let your mind drift now, carried by the rhythm of weaving looms and the whisper of snow against the roof. Let the stories settle like feathers. There is no rush, no danger, just the slow comfort of time stretching out like winter itself, deep and still and safe. You've traveled far tonight, not with sails or swords, but through simpler things, grooming habits, cooking fires, and the universal need to stay warm. And now all that's left is rest. So close your eyes, let the past cradle you, and sleep like a Viking on a winter's night, wrapped in wool held by hearthlight and utterly wonderfully still.